Hello, I'm Sean Lay. Welcome to the programme which brings together leading British journalists, BBC specialists and foreign correspondents who write, broadcast and blog for audiences from the Dateline London. This weekend, the United States declares its return to global leadership at the G7 summit by revising the Atlantic Charter it signed in 1941. But on vaccinating the globe, taxing multinationals, peace in Northern Ireland, treating with China and climate change, is the world of 2021 willing to be led? Joining me to discuss all that and more, Henry Chu, who's run Los Angeles Times Bureau in Beijing, Delhi and Rio. He's now the paper's deputy news editor. The Irish journalist Brian O'Connell was London editor for Ireland's public service broadcaster RTE. And here with me in the studio is Celia Hatton, the BBC's Asia Pacific editor. Warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for being with us, and thank you too for being with us at home. Now, 80 years ago, on what is now Canada's Atlantic coast, in the midst of war, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt signed the Atlantic Charter. Tack due east and fast forward 8 decades, and on England's Atlantic coast, their modern-day successors, Boris Johnson and Joe Biden, have signed anew. What the G7 leaders who convened Friday may not know is that Cornwall, in England's far southwest, is a county of changeable weather. Atlantic squalls can blow up without warning. Though the surf is slight, the water may be churning underneath. Henry, in terms of the relationship between the UK and the United States, first of all, since they were the signatories of the original Atlantic Charter, Boris Johnson described it as being like a breath of fresh air dealing with the Biden administration. But I wonder if the air is blowing hot or cold at the moment between London and Washington.
Well, I think this reminds me a little bit of when Obama became president and all of Europe gave a sigh of relief, basically because he was not George W. Bush. Well, the same dynamic is happening here, where leaders are smiling and feeling there's a spring in their step because it's no longer Donald Trump. So I think already that has created for some better atmospherics across the Atlantic. It does always amuse or bemuse me a little bit whenever these summits come around, and that this taking of the temperature of the Anglo-American relationship is really a preoccupation here in London and in the UK. But I'm sorry to say it's not really of much significance in a larger sense in the US. There is not the same kind of anxiety or a constant taking of this temperature. And that is, of course, because Britain is the junior partner in this relationship. But that said, I would like to point out that the broad contours of the Anglo-American relationship have been fairly steady throughout the decades from the time of that first Atlantic Charter being signed. You have shared intelligence, a shared history, a shared language that some say divides us. Right now, Britain is still the US's largest investment partner and its fourth largest trading partner. So there might be some hiccups and some disagreements between the occupants of the White House and 10 Downing Street. But on the whole, I think the footing is still solid. Now, Boris Johnson, of course, clung fairly tightly to Trump, and you had Biden calling Johnson during the campaign a clone of Trump. So there might be a little bit of personal issues to work out, but so far, so good, I think.
Celia, the United States is, as well as an Atlantic nation, increasingly a Pacific one. Japan is also present at the G7. How does this G7 format work for those other countries, particularly in a region where it's not overly represented in this particular framework of international diplomacy?
No, that's right. Well, countries in the Asia Pacific are watching to see what is going on in Cornwall. They're looking for the scale of commitments made to things like vaccine distribution and climate change. Of course, they're also looking to see how firm an alliance the G7 countries will pose to China and how firmly they will try to counter China's rise. Some countries will be watching with some trepidation talk about this global corporate tax agreement that's in the works. Countries or regions like Hong Kong, the Chinese territory of Hong Kong, but also Singapore, that like to offer corporations quite generous perks, might be starting to be concerned as we edge closer to a global tax agreement that they won't be so lucrative in the future.
Brian, that is a challenge for Ireland, isn't it? We've heard Pascal Donoghue, the Irish Treasury Minister, has been doing interviews around the fringes of the G7 about his government's perspective on this. How worried are the Irish? Because Ireland's got quite a good reputation in the last couple of years in terms of its international diplomacy, of being able to influence the United States, not least, of course, over Brexit. We'll talk about that in a minute. But in terms of this tax proposal, how big a potential threat is it for the Irish?
It's a big issue. It's definitely a big issue for the Irish. Irish corporation tax is about 12.5% at the moment. But through the OECD, and particularly the French, what the French are more concerned about is they talk about tax justice. The Irish talk about tax competition. And it's not so much that the Irish have a rate which is less than half of what French corporate tax rate is. It is simply that if Ireland were to stick to that rate, that would be fine. It is the rate. So if it's 12.5%, it's 12.5%, not under 1%, for example. That's always been the problem. The sweetheart deals with the Googles and the Apples and the big tech companies that has happened over the years. In fact, there's still an outstanding issue of about 13 billion in back tax, which is due to the Irish government, which hasn't actually been sent back to the Irish government yet via the EU. So that is still to be worked through. It's going to take some time. But Pascal Donoghue, as you say, he's been doing the rounds, and his argument is he's not worried about getting foreign direct investment into Ireland, but he does feel, and this is the majority of the coalition Irish government feel, that Ireland doesn't have heavy industry. France does. Germany has. Ireland was an agrarian economy after the foundation of the state, and has become a service economy, and now it lives off the funding of foreign direct investment, and that other countries have a different shaped economy, and that Ireland should be allowed to maintain its tax advantage of some kind, along with some other, some other similar sized countries within the EU and within the OECD.
Henry, it's an issue for the United States as well, isn't it? Because presumably Joe Biden wants to protect Silicon Valley and those new industries as far as he can. Is there room for compromise here? I mean, given the EU is divided internally on this issue anyway, is there some kind of compromise that can be worked through, do you think, this weekend?
I think there is. Often with these kinds of agreements, of course, there will be loopholes that will be baked in to benefit certain industries. This is all part of the give and take of these kinds of negotiations. If you remember, the Biden administration actually proposed this global corporate tax of, I think it was 21%, which it might be lower than what the French had wanted, and is certainly far higher than what Ireland would want to see come out of this. So I think there is some wiggle room. You're right that Biden does want to make sure that Silicon Valley is not overly penalized, not through the corporate tax, but through these digital services taxes that are beginning to be imposed in various European countries, the UK included. In fact, that is one of the hiccups between Britain and the US right now in terms of threatened tariffs against the UK because of this digital services tax. But I think there is going to be some bargaining back and forth. There probably will be some kind of announcement that can paper over some of these differences. And people won't get everything they want, but that's the nature of negotiation.
Now, there was some frustration expressed by Boris Johnson's predecessor in an interview she gave to a British newspaper Friday about the fact that travel and therefore international trade is still held up because of the pandemic. Vaccination's the big theme. You mentioned it already, Celia. Joe Biden talking about the United States as the arsenal of the world in terms of providing all these jabs to poorer or less developed countries. The people in Cornwall this weekend are saying, yeah, it's fine, but it's nowhere near enough. And meanwhile, in your region, they're already starting to see a further expansion, a further threat from further waves, additional waves of infection. What's happening in Asia Pacific?
Well, it's really interesting to hear the words of Joe Biden. When you look at the Asia Pacific region, actually the countries that are doing the best in rolling out their vaccination drives are the ones that made a decision early on that they were going to accept Chinese vaccines. Let's forget what Joe Biden has to offer. So countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, they're surging ahead in vaccinating their populations. The countries that aren't doing so well, maybe they're not doing so well for a variety of reasons. So North Korea, for example, mysteriously, we haven't heard anything about whether they're getting Chinese vaccines. Let's assume they're not. They were supposed to get 2 million vaccines through the COVAX scheme. That's been held up because North Korea won't reveal how they're going to distribute their vaccines, which is part of the of that program. A country like Japan, they've really just been very, very slow to approve any vaccines. They've kind of bungled the distribution. They're trying to sort that out now, but really it's only over 65s, maybe by the end of the summer. And a country like Vietnam really wanted to distribute its own vaccine. That's going very slowly. So they, this week, made the reluctant decision to accept Chinese vaccines. So still, not much mention of Joe Biden there.
No, Henry, the IMF has done a calculation that reckons about 70% of the world could be vaccinated for $50 billion US. But the increased global output, if the world did that, could be something like 9 trillion within 4 years. It looks like a no-brainer. If you want the global economy to recover, you vaccinate the world. And yet the leaders around the G7 table still seem to be haggling and hesitating over how much money they want to spend on this.
That's right. I think some of them, of course, are preoccupied with getting their own populations vaccinated, but we're already seeing that countries like the US and the UK have vast surpluses of vaccine doses that could indeed be exported before they expire, hopefully, obviously, to other parts of the world. And we certainly have heard from scientists on the epidemiological score that we're not safe until everyone is safe. And although some of us in countries where the vaccine rollout has gone well, we might be thinking that we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, that the pandemic might be almost over. For us, that is not true in these other parts of the world, where, for example, in Africa, you have countries that are called vaccine deserts. There's not a single vaccine getting injected into anyone's arm in those countries. And that's going to pose a great threat to overall global prosperity, and certainly that continent and other places like it.
So when Joe Biden and Boris Johnson talk about having a kind of a special group that's going to look at reopening transatlantic travel, you're not expecting Brits on Broadway anytime soon?
Well, right now, travel is prohibited between the two countries. I think with the vaccinations proceeding well on both sides of the Atlantic, there might be some headway made in terms of travel for those who have been fully inoculated at this point. That might present an easier prospect for Americans who want to come over to Britain, because right now in the US, all of the vaccinations, the vaccines that have been approved and authorized for use are accepted here. Going the other way, what's interesting right now is AstraZeneca has not yet been authorized by the US. Anthony Fauci has even said that it might not be necessary for the US. And if that's the case, all the people who have been vaccinated with AstraZeneca here, myself included, might be wondering, how can we get over to the US even though we've been inoculated with a very good vaccine?
Brian, let's talk about something that you could almost describe as the elephant of the room. They tried to deal with it, get it out the way before the G7, but it's far from being resolved. And this is the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol, the trading arrangement that was agreed as part of the Brexit deal by Boris Johnson and the European Union. How serious a problem is this? We've heard the rhetoric, but how really serious a problem is it, Brian?
It is serious. There's no doubt about that. And it will need to be resolved in pretty short order, I think, one way or another. It's not, G7s, as you know, Sean, are not places where disagreement very often becomes public, except for with President Trump in Canada in 2018 when he walked out. But they don't like to wash their dirty linen in public, I suppose. The row did happen, reportedly, between Lord Frost and the American chargé d'affaires when she went to Lord Frost and issued a démarche, which was a diplomatic telling off, I suppose, and was left in no doubt of America's concern over this. It's certainly not going to go away. There has been a lot of comment on why the EU, why the Americans have got involved in this, but actually under the Good Friday Agreement, they are part of two international facilitators and safeguarders of that agreement, America and the EU. So there are ways around it, I suppose, but it's very difficult to let diplomats and negotiators do this when there's so much sort of public spatting going on, if I can put it that way. For example, the EU did ask if Britain could align itself in terms of the SPS checks. These are the checks on sausages and other chilled meats that's caused this latest row, and they won't do that obviously because they feel we took back control in the Brexit referendum, and we're not going to now just accept and copy and paste EU regulations into the British system. So, and there are a few other things, but it's going to take time. The thing about it is that if Boris Johnson suspends this, it's going to make matters a lot worse. And there is some talk of him actually suspending these checks and so on, and suspending the protocol before the Loyalist marching season. But I think that would cause an awful lot of damage to relations, and that if he doesn't do that, there is a chance, I think, that there can be temporary fixes, patches, and so on, until they can actually get it put back together again. But certainly at the moment, it's not looking good, and we're not going to see a big row in at the G7 over this. But you will have noted President Macron's remarks before he left France to come to Cornwall, where he said that we're not going to sit down and renegotiate something that we signed up to and the British signed up to just at the end of last year.
Henry.
Well, I think when it comes to the U.S., I mean, woe betide anyone who would underestimate Joe Biden's commitment to making the Good Friday Agreement work. He's incredibly proud of his Irish heritage. You might even remember back in November after he won the election, a viral clip went around showing him saying to a BBC reporter who wanted a word, he said, "BBC, I'm Irish." So he certainly has that connection with his ancestral homeland. Plus, when he was in the Senate on the Foreign Relations Committee during the Clinton administration, he pushed the administration to really help to make an effort to resolve the troubles. And so he has a lot invested in that personally, both from an emotional point of view and from a political point of view. I think even during the campaign, he warned Boris Johnson that Brexit could not threaten and jeopardize what the security of Ireland and Northern Ireland and the peace process. And so I think although there won't be anything too public in Cornwall in terms of disagreements just sort of blooming in the public sphere, I think plenty is going on behind the scenes with the Biden administration.
And at least we've got pretty much all the international players and the guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement in the same room this weekend. Let's talk about the other big issue. We'll park Russia for now, because we know that President Biden is going on to meet Vladimir Putin. We'll probably be talking about that on next week's programme. We know there's the NATO summit coming up that Boris Johnson, Macron and Joe Biden will also be at. What about China, though? Because China is critical to Joe Biden and Boris Johnson's ambitions for climate change. We had a very dramatic intervention by President Xi Jinping last year when he kind of basically said, we're going to do our bit. And yet they're all now starting to talk similar language, at least among G7 nations, about China and Uyghurs, China and Hong Kong, China and Taiwan. Is the relationship going to sour further, do you think? And is there a sense that the G7 nations are on the same page when it comes to China now?
I think that the relations will probably stay the same as they are. I think China's really sort of accepted G7 criticism over the Uyghurs, over Hong Kong. And I think they're really going to just stay on course with what they've been doing, frankly. I mean, we heard some conciliatory words from Xi Jinping earlier this week, where he said that he thought that China needed to use warmer words when addressing the outside world. But we haven't really seen, that's one speech, So this kind of wolf warrior diplomacy, as we've been getting from Chinese diplomats for the past few years, that's got quite a long track record. And I think it would take much more than one speech from Mr. Xi to really change course on anything.
There is a different kind of structure that exists, isn't there? The Quad, which has been mentioned a couple of times during the course of the weekend. So you've got Japan and the US, who are G7 members, who are also part of this arrangement, and then India and Australia, and they have been invited to attend the G7 as observers. Is the Quad turning into something more meaningful, do you think, in terms of being a kind of security kind of pact or defence against China?
Oh, absolutely. I think the Quad is really has not tried to hide its ambitions to really counter China's rise. I think they've really made it very clear what their intentions are. Even it just comes down even to the U.S. government's language. Continually calling it the Indo-Pacific. China does not like that language. Sometimes it just comes down to the words that you use and the names that you use for things. And I think the Quad is really quite powerful. I think it means a lot that they've also been invited to this very important G7 meeting.
Henry, does it mean a lot to Joe Biden? Because President Obama talked about a tilt towards the Pacific in his presidency. Biden was his vice president. Do you think that's still there? Is that instinct that actually, it's fine to talk about the Atlantic Charter, it's fine to be nice to the Brits, but really, longer term, our focus needs to be on that part of the globe?
Absolutely. It was a pivot under Obama, and Biden, having been his vice president, is continuing that. You can see that already in some of the appointments that he's made. He's appointed some very high-level officials in the administration to look at Asia, but we don't have ambassadors in some of these European capitals yet, including here in London. So the priorities are fairly plain from that in terms of what he's turning his attention to. And China, it's interesting, it's not mentioned at all in this new Atlantic Charter 2.0 anywhere, but it is obviously a looming presence in the fact that you have the Quad present. You have Biden talking about dangers when it comes to cyber attacks, and that's pointed at both Russia and China. So I think this is quite on Biden's mind, and that he wants the democracies of the world to come together to show their durability and show that they still offer the best way. They're not necessarily to spread democracy, but to shore it up and to counter the rise of what he sees as autocracies in the Asia-Pacific region.
Well, we might have an idea by the end of this weekend whether America is indeed back and whether the rest of the world is prepared to accept its leadership on some of these issues. For now, thanks very much for going through all of that here. We've got a few minutes. Let's just give each of you the chance to maybe mark the audience's cards for any other stories you think that maybe haven't been getting the attention they should. Brian, do you want to kick off first?
Yes, I think, we were talking about Brexit and Northern Ireland a moment ago, and the big problem with that, I suppose, is trust. There's a lack of trust between the EU and the UK, and you get the feeling that Boris Johnson isn't actually trusted by Brussels at the moment. One example of that, if you actually want to know about Boris Johnson, look at the story earlier this week when there was a bit of a row in the House of Commons about a reduction in Britain's foreign aid contribution from 7% of gross national income to 5%. Now, that represents something in the region of about £4 billion a year. It actually makes a huge difference to what they're doing, and vaccine rollout that they're talking about now, and donations of vaccines aren't going to make up for that huge loss. But Boris Johnson, in doing that and then not allowing a vote of MPs in the Commons on it, which his government would probably lose, tells you that he is prepared to abandon the legislation that he passed in the House of Commons in 2015, and that is bound by international treaty, which he's now broken, and he has no respect, and he doesn't heed Parliament at all. No, so that's not a great look when you're going to be global Britain going around the world looking for new trade deals. And
it might explain why Brussels is nervous about whether he might walk away from the protocol.
Yes.
Henry. brief
I
one
was
if you
talking
could.
about democracies just a moment ago. Well, one of the most robust democracies in Latin America is in Peru, where we've just had a runoff election, and that is now on a knife edge between Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of former President Alberto Fujimori, who's in prison on corruption charges, and a left-wing populist, a novice, a school teacher named Pedro Castillo, who is now in a slight lead over Fujimori. We need to keep our eye on this because the Fujimori camp is now beginning to put out claims of election fraud a la Trump, as we saw back in November in the US. And there is a potential now for political violence in a nation that has been relatively stable when it comes to democratic practice. So I would keep my eye on the ball there in Peru.
Henry, thank you very much. Celia.
I've been watching the U.S. Senate this week. They passed the biggest industrial bill in U.S. history, $250 billion, which will be aimed at trying to improve U.S. competitiveness against China in fields of science and technology. So it's the biggest investment in scientific research in decades, and it's going to pour tons of money into things like artificial intelligence, robotics, semiconductors, all of that kind of stuff. So it's a really big deal.
Okay, last final word then, take us back to the G7. Just each of you briefly in turn. Henry, first of all, what will be the thing that you're looking out for at the end of the G7 to know that it's been a success or not?
I think this global tax agreement really is something that is, I don't want to say revolutionary, that might sound a little bit too heavy, but is something that if they can actually come to an agreement, that could at least go some measure towards correcting some of the inequalities that we have in this world.
Brian?
I think we need a bit more detail on vaccines, and not just vaccine donations, because if you listen to people like former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, he says you're going to need billions, about 15, 11, 12, 13 billion, something of that order in vaccines. And you're going to have to deal with the copyright issues and intellectual property issues so that vaccines can be manufactured at a reasonable cost in the developing world where they do have the facilities. India is a perfect example of that.
Celia?
And I'll be looking to see if countries like Canada and Japan give in to pressure to boost their climate change commitments.
Celia Hatton, Henry Chu and Brian O'Connell, thank you all very much. Thank you two very much for joining us on Dateline. We're back at the same time next week. Goodbye.